Well, it is noon, so let me pass this over to the student moderators, commenters, to start with their comments and then moderate the session.
The U.S. confirmed coronavirus cases now top 11.
Now?
Hi, who wants to go first to summarize?
Yeah.
There
okay.
you are.
So, hello everybody. My name is Edna Pedraza, and I'll be one of the moderators of this week. I'll be summarizing Frankie's and Aman's talk. Frankie is a student in the Department of Anthropology, and she's working with environmental anthropology applied to climate change and human adaptation. She's a student of the interdisciplinary PhD program, and her talk was about the use of mollusk bivalves as proxies of El Niño Southern Oscillation. As she summarized, El Niño is a periodic alteration of atmospheric pressure and sea surface temperature affecting the eastern equatorial Pacific, and the effects of this oscillation are changes in sea surface temperature and precipitation anomalies. So she presented the objectives of her current research, and she focused on three specific problems. The first one is to assess which of the bivalve species in the coast of Peru can be used as better proxies to track the frequency and intensity of El Niño by comparison of oxygen isotopes records of bivalve species with local and regional instrumental records of marine conditions. The second objective of her research was to evaluate a new bivalve species not usually included as part of the proxies. This species is Tibella hyans, and her idea is to know if this species can enhance Paleo El Niño research by studying the increments in the shelf of this species to know if oxygen isotopes, biomineralization, or both aspects in the valves of this organism can be used as proxies of sea surface temperature or El Niño events. And finally, she focused on assess the agreement between sea surface temperature readings extracted from the valves of the mollusk via delta 18O with regional sea surface temperature records and from satellite records to know if both elements can be used to understand the changes in the Peruvian coast with El Niño. So now I am going to give the opportunity to Mariana.
Yep. So I'll summarize. Last week, Hunter Tubbs presented on the influence of coupled model sea surface temperature biases on tropical cyclone environmental conditions. He talked about how oceans play a role in the global system and how the ocean surface is the interface between the ocean and the atmosphere. Therefore, changes in the ocean's surface can alter atmospheric conditions. He analyzed output from idealized climate model experiments and utilized indices developed to relate atmospheric and sea surface conditions to tropical cyclone genesis and tropical cyclone potential intensity. He then compared the results and observations and examined the differences. The model did a good job capturing the overall observed pattern. However, there were some overestimations and underestimations. He also mentioned that future work includes examining which environmental terms result in the largest changes in the tropical cyclone indices. And I'll turn it over to Peter Strand.
All right. And then last time we also had Madeline Woods presenting. Madeline shared the plans for her research project, which is studying abrupt ocean changes in the Northwest Atlantic Ocean. These abrupt changes punctuate an apparent cooling trend during the Holocene time period, and Madeline is planning, if all things go according to plan, to go on a research cruise next summer to cover the Gulf of Maine, on which she'll be collecting whole water samples and also sediment cores for analysis. And then on the foraminifera she recovers, she'll be performing bulk ICP mass spectrometry measurements, as well as laser ablation mass spectrometry in order to create a delta 18O delta 18 oxygen and magnesium calcium record over the Holocene time period. So with that, I think we can get into the talks today.
Okay, so I have the pleasure to present Heather Landazuri. She's a student in the Department of Anthropology. Her work turns around the prehistoric El Niño using multidisciplinary elements, but also she wants to improve modeling tools to mitigate disasters induced by climate change. Her title, or the title of her talk, is The New Kid on the Block, El Niño Modoki, Past, Present, and Future.
Let's see. All right, guys. Everybody see it okay? Awesome. So yeah, like Edna said, we're going to be talking about El Niño Modoki in Peru, past, present, and future. Let's see. There we go. So this is just a brief outline of what we're going to be going over today: research objectives, explanation of Enzo and Enzo flavors, the effects of El Niño and El Niño Modoki in Peru, and known proxy for Enzo's, potential archaeological proxies for El Niño Modoki, and future research potential. So the research objectives that I'm presenting today focus on the paleoclimatological research potential of El Niño Modoki on the northern coast of Peru, with a specific focus on archaeological proxy sources, prehistoric adaptive strategies, and modern applications. So just a quick overview. The El Niño Southern Oscillation is a coupled oceanic and atmospheric climate phenomenon that occurs on interannual and decadal timescales and influences global temperature and precipitation. Its impacts are felt most acutely in Peru, as you can see here. This is also where it was first identified and named. It occurs in a variety of flavors or modalities, and each presents differing impacts on the hydrological systems in Peru and elsewhere. So during what we call the canonical or Eastern Pacific El Niño, you get this warming of the Peru current and a general warming in the Eastern Pacific. And this warming of the Peru current causes water to condense over the coastal desert rather than in the highlands, which is where it would normally rain. And this results in heavy coastal precipitation and westerly stream flow anomalies throughout Peru. Flood damage to canal intakes and irrigation systems disrupt agricultural production, and fisheries experience mass migrations and mortalities of fish and other marine biota as a result of the warming sea surface temperatures and weakening nutrient upwelling. So, and on top of all of this, there's also related issues with public health risks in the form of vector-borne diseases, poor sanitation linked to amplified risk of cholera and respiratory infection. So El Niño Modoki, on the other hand, or Central Pacific El Niño, CP, as you'll see it throughout the presentation, was first scientifically recognized in the early 2000s, and it generates warm sea surface temperature anomalies in the Central Pacific Basin that are flanked on either side by cooler sea surface temperatures. And because of this, Peru doesn't experience increased sea surface temperatures during Modoki, but the atmospheric dynamics associated with it lead to low precipitation in the highlands and attenuated water flow to the coast, sometimes by as much as 50%. So these drought-like conditions have a severe impact on the wetlands as well as Peru's irrigation-based agriculture. And for the last 3 decades, as you'll see here, El Niño Modoki has increased in frequency, and it's projected to continue to do so concurrent with increased global warming and climate change. So here, I've adapted this timeline from Freund et al. 2020. And you can see, CP kind of, or El Niño Modoki kind of increases and fluctuates along with El Niño, canonical El Niño events. And I will point out this part of the data is still to be determined, as we haven't gotten into 2050 yet. So there's this general trend that you can see here, and there are some that speculate that ENSO phenomena occur on this continuum where there's always one phase, whether it be, you know, canonical El Nino and La Nina, El Nino Modoki, or even coastal El Nino events, which we've seen in 2017. So considering the societal and environmental gravity of ENSO phenomena, improving our understanding of all the flavors and previous events is essential not only to anticipating future events, but also to mitigating their effects on human populations. And one way of doing this is through the analysis of paleoclimate proxies, such as ice or sediment cores, mollusk shells, fish otoliths, or even tree rings. And here I've compiled a table of common proxies used to detect ENSO phenomena, as well as the length of time or resolution that each records. And as you can see, they're pretty applicable to most. The ones most commonly used in archaeological settings are these here. And they're only really have been tried thus far for the canonical El Nino. So in locations like Peru, these natural proxy records are rare, absent, or sometimes unreliable. And that makes archaeological sites really crucial as paleoclimatological archives. Because they contain these climate signals in well-defined and datable contexts, and as a bonus are directly associated with past human behavior, so you can study interactions, responses. As it stands, we know a lot about the prehistoric impacts of canonical El Nino on coastal Andean communities, thanks to archaeological proxies and work done by Dan, Kirk, etc., our own faculty. But the other modes of ENSO remain under-examined, at least for El Nino Modoki. Looking at past instances of drought could provide some insight into how coastal Andeans might have reacted to the drought-like conditions brought on by it. And so studying human and animal remains would be two useful methods of investigating this connection. For instance, drought is commonly linked to increased malnutrition and migration in modern and prehistoric communities, and can be traced either archaeologically through isotopic analyses of bone, teeth, or hair, or in modern cases through census and public health reports, just off the top of our heads here. So it would be, you would expect to see potentially these migrations in search of ecological refugia archaeologically, or periods of malnutrition as a result of limited resources that could be detected through, like I said, these bioarchaeological analyses. More along the lines of my thesis work, studies of past human subsistence economies show that canonical events have both positive and negative effects on marine and terrestrial resources. And so it's therefore more likely that similar connections exist for El Nino Modoki. For instance, where canonical events are disruptive to marine bird populations, which is what I'm examining, and beneficial to wetland bird populations, one would expect the reverse for Modoki. So a sudden or short-term increase or decrease in wetland species could serve as a proxy for Modoki-related drought. So clearly, Modoki events have sparked much debate and research surrounding their causes, and there seems to be a general sense of concern, especially in the sense that, like, we expect that they should increase along with global warming. And as it stands, they really have a drastic impact on the hydrology of Peru. They've been shown to reduce stream flow to the Chacama River to levels before normal, resulting in water shortages. And like canonical effects, the effects of Modoki must trickle down to other social sectors, such as agriculture, public health. However, because it is a more recent discovery, new studies have yet to really examine this, leaving ample room for expanded research. Archaeologically, even more potential lies in the examination of like drought-resistant food sources, such as lizards. So you'll see the cañones here. Some studies indicate that these lizards were captured and eaten with relative ease and were considered highly nutritive and valuable under normal circumstances. And there are some documents that have accounts of them being eaten during times of El Nino duress. So if relied upon during times of scarcity, one would expect to find the remains in higher numbers during Modoki events relative to normal years. This is something I would really like to examine in the future. And finally, so historic records and ethnographies also have contributed important insight into people's lived experiences and responses during these and other climatological hazards. So tapping into these resources to identify early methods of predicting or adapting to INZO conditions could potentially inform modern mitigation planning. And to represent that, I included a photo of the Pleiades, which is said to become more apparent or blocked depending on El Nino events. And so they're used as a form of traditional ecological knowledge to detect or predict when these events are coming up and allowing early populations to plan ahead. So as you can see, archaeological sites offer a myriad of climatological insights in various forms, and there are doubtless many more that we haven't figured out yet, making continued research in this area like super important. And yeah, continued interdisciplinary research is crucial to advancing our understanding of INZO flavors and their impacts on human and non-human systems. So if there are any questions, otherwise, thank you.
Okay, does anyone have questions for Heather? Okay.
I have one small question.
Sure.
I was just curious, but what are otoliths? You
Oh.
mentioned that in the beginning.
Are this kind of inner ear bone that fish develop through their lifetime, and they're really great for recording seasonality of water temperature. I believe it's water temperatures and nutrients. I could be wrong, we need to check. But that's what they're typically used for. So they're used for seasonality, and you can get a pretty good idea of like what a faunal assemblage, when they were harvested and the climate and sea surface temperatures that they were harvested in.
Wow, that's really cool. Thanks.
Heather, you talked about using traditional ecological knowledge and interdisciplinary research. Are there any disciplines that you feel like need to be brought in that haven't been already?
So in prep for this project, I looked into even just like we're doing in class, ecological anthropology studies of this stuff, and there's not a whole lot out there specifically on fisheries. There's information out there on fisheries management, kind of the policy side of it, but there's not really a whole lot looking into traditional ecological knowledge in terms of mitigation and even just prediction. There was the one study of the Pleiades, but otherwise there's not a whole lot out there just yet. And it might just be because we aren't really looking at historic records and things like that. So honestly, I think I'm of the mindset that the more the merrier. If you have some insight and you're from a field that could potentially help, ecology, paleoecology, anthropology, archaeology, ice core analysis, all of these different disciplines are really informative and will help bolster this kind of research. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Are there any more questions?
Yep, sorry. This is Paul here. Quick comment. A very good presentation, Heather. You may have already done this, but in partial response to the previous question, you might want to talk to Sean Burkle. He's currently looking at very detailed weather records that go back just a few years, but also in some cases, maybe 30 years. So there's certainly a couple of examples of each of the El Nino situations. And he can guide you along, obviously, with Kirk, who I'm sure you're working with, to see exactly what the extent is in terms of precipitation, temperature change, what the duration of the event is, some details that that might be of use to you.
Awesome, thank you. I'll contact him.
Certainly.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. If I can get my pointer to respond. There we go.
Are there any more questions before we move on to the next presentation? I'll take that as a no. Okay, so next up is Ian Nesbitt, and he will be presenting on post-glacial sedimentary architecture and accumulation rate of oligotrophic, not sure if I'm saying that right, lake in central Maine in the United States. Take it away.
Thank you, Mariana. Can you all see that? Yep, okay.
Yep.
So I actually have a slight schedule change. My talk will actually be on a bit of a broader topic than just the single oligotrophic lake in central Maine. This is a decision-making framework for sedimentation analyses in dammed river corridor impoundments. And what I hope to do is sort of provide a simple sort of basis for you to think about how to decide where your core analyses should be taken from certain lakes. So in the sort of simple vein, this talk might be titled, How to Pick a Coring Site for Your Study. What I hope to impress on you is that it actually matters where you do take cores from lakes. And so with that, I will start. So how do we decide where to core in lakes? That question is most often sort of broken up into questions about why we're actually coring in the first place. So sedimentation effects of damming a corridor, that might be one thing you might want to study. Micro or macro fossils, you might want dates and sedimentation rates, or you might want to look at lake level changes, paleovegetation, or other types of climate proxies. And all of these types of cores will necessarily require you to they'll sort of push you towards different types of sediment. And so how do we make sure we know where we're going to find those things in a particular lake? So if I can take you to this hypothetical New England lake, this is one that has sort of two subbasins in it. This is, depending on sort of when you are studying, be it in the sort of 1950s, you might go to the center of the lake, you might go to the bathymetric maximum of the lake, and depending on where you go, you might find sort of different answer here. So, you know, depending on which of these sort of sub-maxima you go to in the lake to core, you might end up with a different package of sediment. So here in this example image I have, you've got the brown yicha, the organic rich, quote unquote Holocene sediment, where there's a lot of vegetation on the landscape, and then this clay package below it that's quote unquote Pleistocene, but more likely it's just, you know, before any paleovegetation actually arrived on the landscape after the glacier receded. And we actually do find this in real life. So this is a rather noisy GPR transect here, but if you ignore all of this horizontal noise in the water column, you can see that there are several different sediment types here. So this blue line indicates the water sediment interface, the orange line indicates the organic inorganic interface, and this green line indicates the lake sediment and prior interface. And by prior, I mean subglacial, most likely. So this is a real New England lake. This is in central Maine, the oligotrophic lake that I was going to talk about and will be talking about actually later in this talk. So with that in mind, let's get into the background a little bit. The coring community has known about problems with spatial variability in lake sediments in New England for decades, most notably George Jacobson and Richard Bradshaw in 1981, and then Davis and Ford in 1982 in Mirror Lake. And they were sort of the first ones to sort of describe that spatial variability in sedimentation in previously glaciated areas. So the way I'm proposing to solve that is by investigating these relatively shallow lakes with GPR. GPR in New England shallow lakes is not new. Steve Arconi published a paper in 2018 outlining in sedimentology, outlining his previous experiences with GPR and also sort of a historical background of it. And GPR has actually been used to find core sites before, including in Maine, although it's usually been done in 2 dimensions. So for example, Andy Offenbacher-Krall and Andrea Nurse in 2005 did a study in northern Maine in a lake where they essentially went across with a GPR profile and then took cores along that profile. So none of this is exactly new, but I do hope to sort of convey to you that there's really a good reason to do this. So let's get into a little bit of GPR background. GPR is a non-destructive geophysical method that uses a transmitter and a receiver, and then a computer that digitizes the signal that the receiver gets back. And essentially what's happening here is that you're sending a wave of electrical energy down into the substrate, whatever that is, and the wave is bouncing off of electrical contrast between different layers. So these resistivities here, as noted by the epsilons with the different subnumbers, indicate different electrical contrasts, and that's essentially what the wave is bouncing off of. So then you move across that substrate and you get a profile of the layers that exist and that have electrical contrast between them. Now there is a little bit of math involved in this, as you might imagine, but I won't get into the math that much. Just suffice it to say that these electrical contrasts between the layers result in changes in how that wave travels through those media. So changes in the speed of light, or rather the speed at which the wave travels through the medium, and also refraction based on the entrance angle of that wave into the medium. So the cons of GPR are that the water must be very fresh. So any salinity or any dissolved materials in it will typically cause there to be a more conductive water column, and therefore you'll lose a lot more of that signal. Shallow bathymetry works best. It doesn't do all that well in hydrocarbon-rich layers, such as methane layers, but it does better than sub-bottom acoustic profiling, which tends to be absorbed very strongly by those types of layers. The pros are that it's portable, it can resolve stratigraphic detail fairly well, and it's relatively inexpensive, and I put that in quotations because you will still end up spending many thousands of dollars on these things. So here are a couple field scenarios that we have used for GPR on lakes. On the left here is, so these both come from the Tarn in Acadia. So on the left, I'm skiing over the ice layer in the winter, and on the right, we're putting the GPR in the bottom of an Old Town trip or canoe and paddling across. So it's fairly versatile. You can use it in multiple different ways, and it gives you more or less the same answer to in both cases, or in all of those cases rather. So then you end up, once you do go out and come back with data, you end up with profiles like these, where you can pick each of these layers, as I showed before, and come up with an answer once you plug, these numbers into that those math equations I was showing before. And then once you do that, you can interpolate these into thickness maps. So bringing it from 2 dimensions into 2.5 dimensions, or 3 dimensions, quote unquote, and come up with maps of sediment thickness in different parts of the lakes that you're surveying. So the study site that I'm talking about here is Kingsbury Pond in central western Maine, sort of on the eastern border of the Appalachians here. And Kingsbury Pond is relatively, it's a very interesting place. It's got a lot of sort of subglacial and immediately post-glacial features on this landscape. The one that we'll be talking about the most here is these streamline features, these sort of fluted features that go from northwest to southeast on this LiDAR image here. And these essentially are subglacial flutes. So if you've taken any glacial geology, you'll understand that these things are built by the bottom of that glacier as kilometers of ice ride up on top of this landscape. And as we would expect, the sediment thickness in this lake is more or less correspondent to essentially the direction in which these subglacial features go. So you can notice here in this thickness map that I've made that that sort of each of these thicker packages of sediment in this lake are oriented in that same direction. And this makes sense because those particular flutes underneath the glacier do correspond with differences in sedimentation in the lake itself. And this is what I really want to drive home, is that this type of thing is not all that uncommon. And so depending on where you do take a core in this lake, you could end up with a different answer for how thick certain layers are. So if you think about this profile again, each of these little undulations here more or less corresponds to one of those subglacial flutes. And that shows up in that thickness map, the 2.5D thickness map that I've shown you there. And so depending on where you core in this particular lake, you could core in the bathymetric maximum here and get a mixture of Holocene, modern, and Pleistocene, and these should be in quotations because they're obviously not exactly corresponding to those time periods. But you could end up with a mixture that's mostly Holocene and Pleistocene in this bathymetric maximum here, and then a slightly greater percentage of Pleistocene on this ternary diagram if you core in this other area here, which I think corresponds to post-glacial outwash area. Or you could be looking for a more Holocene signal. So if you notice this sort of scoured rill here, there is erosion happening, and this erosion is still fresh. So it's more or less attributable to colonization. There's a lot of logging in this area, so a lot of this this Holocene, or rather anthropogenic sediment is going to end up in this sort of delta here. So if you wanted to core that, you would go to an area like this. So in conclusion, depending on what you're actually looking for in this lake, what you want in your core, you could really change the types of things that you're getting based on where you're going. So in summary, complexity has traditionally been a challenge to the lake coring community, and the lake coring community has known about it for 40 years or so. And GPR can help establish where to place your core sites and to put those cores in a stratigraphic context, not simply looking at that one spot, but extrapolating out from that in 2 dimensions. And I'll close with a photo of actual coring taking place. This is in the Tarn a couple of years ago. And then this on the right here is us actually coring in Kingsbury Pond in 2018. And with that, I will take any questions.
Great, thank you, Ian. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question for Ian. So it seems like from this lake that you've established some features in the landscape that you might be able to use to kind of extrapolate these findings to other lakes. I was wondering if that's kind of what you're thinking, or if you are thinking more that GPR should be done at any lake that's being considered for coring before going into it.
I think it's not necessarily that cut and dry. I think in a landscape that's so full of subglacial features like this, like in fact most of Maine, it might be useful to establish what's underneath that sediment, what's controlling the deposition of that sediment. And so in post-glacial lakes especially, I would say GPR is very useful. I think it sort of depends on the area you're going to. If you have a perfect bowl lake, you may not need it at all. But most lakes are not perfect like that. And so if you are going to a shallow lake that's got some identifiable features on the landscape around it, I think it does make sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Ian, I have a question. I just wanted to clarify my understanding. So subglacial feature would be something that was present before the last glaciation, and a post-glacial feature would be something present afterwards. Is that right?
What I mean by subglacial is essentially features that are shaped by the glacier itself, right? So we had this big ice sheet that covered Maine in the last glacial maximum, and during the several thousand years that it existed in Maine, it did a lot of work on the substrate. So a lot of the features that you find on the ground in Maine are a result of that. Either they're a result of that, or they're a result of directly post-glacial or end glacial, geomorphological features being deposited. And so a lot of Maine either has these fluted features. A lot of the lowlands have been covered by this immediately post-glacial clay that came in when the marine transgression was active, and so it's a lot of our substrate these days is essentially directly due to the last glaciation.
Great, thanks.
was wondering if you could comment on the sort of the cost and time commitment. Like if I wanted to do this before coring a lake, what does it take?
For us, I mean, the survey that that produced that particular thickness map was a couple hours, and the lake was 3 kilometers long by 1 kilometer wide, and we ran probably 11 lines across it, which isn't all that much, but it allowed us to make that fairly nice thickness map. So it's it's a day of surveying probably, and then a few days of post-processing and making nice figures. I've been making nice figures for actually a lot longer than a few days though, so that's always a something that you could spend a lot more time on. Does that answer your question, Joe?
Yeah, great, thank you.
All right. Any more questions for Ian? All right, thanks, Ian. So we are continuing to move along here at a good velocity. So we'll keep the momentum going with Scott Braddock. We'll be talking next about mechanisms for glacier acceleration in the southern Patagonian icefield, Chile. Take it away, Scott.
Yeah, let me do this again. Just needed to get the share audio because there is a video and I'm trying to remember how to do that. Share computer. Okay, should be good. All right, we're gonna head back down to South America, the southern tip in Patagonia here. And there's a really big question that's out there. And this project is gonna try to answer a small part of it. But that question is what's driving the retreat of the southern Patagonian icefield in Chile? And this work is done in collaboration with some Chilean partners. CONAF, we're basically the National Park Service down there. They're the stewards of the national parks. This ice field happens to be part of a national park, as well as Round River Conservation Studies. They're a conservation organization that works down in Chile. They've been down there for about 12 years. But this is important because past studies have shown that ice loss from this ice field contributes about 9% of the total input to global sea level rise from mountain glaciers. And of course, rates have been increasing in recent decades. This is something common around the world with mountain glaciers. But what makes this location unique is that there's a disproportionate amount of ice loss relative to the size of the ice field when we compare this to other mountain glaciers around the world. So it's retreating quickly and contributing pretty rapidly as far as contributions from mountain glaciers to sea level rise. So the ultimate goal here is to quantify the glacier behavior in this region, specifically tidewater glaciers in our study sites, by collecting data on glacier properties from time-lapse cameras, and then relating those to ocean properties, as well as outburst flood events. It's a very dynamic field site. And we know we can't yet answer some of these really big questions that we hope to in this region on a limited budget, but we were very fortunate to have this project funded in part by the Dan and Betty Churchill Exploration Fund, as well as American Alpine Club and Geological Society of America. And the idea here is to collect pilot data that we're then going to use to apply to a much bigger external grant. To get everyone oriented with the field site, again, here's South America. We're down on the southern tip. This is Patagonia. It's basically a region that encompasses Chile and Argentina. And this is a really awesome photo from the International Space Station. North is to the right here, but this is the southern Patagonian ice field. The origins of this work, basically, I worked around the ice field for about 3 years before coming back for a PhD with that Round River Conservation Organization, with always the idea in the back of my head, like, oh, we should really get back here and try to study the glaciers on this ice sheet, because my work was more on the biology side. And I floated that idea around when I got back to the department, and then Kristen Schill jumped right on it because studying the ice-ocean interactions here is pretty similar to the work she's already done in Greenland. So she's kind of driving the questions behind this work, and I had a lot of the logistical support and connections in this area. But our original hypothesis is that warm ocean waters are eroding these tidewater glaciers and driving a retreat, specifically in this region up here in this red box. That's where we were able to get to this season. So this is the case that warm ocean waters driving retreat in places such as Greenland, but in other places like Svalbard and Alaska, it seems to be a combination of the warm ocean water and rising atmospheric temperatures. So which mechanism in Patagonia is driving retreat is unanswered because there are very few studies that focus on these mid-latitude glaciers with those questions. So much of the work to date is using remote sensing techniques and satellite imagery. And that's just because it's pretty difficult to get down here to access these sites, and it's fairly rough weather conditions, which is what makes this study so exciting to actually get down there and do it. But this picture here is a little hard to see because it's so dark, but the green line is basically our boat path as we snake our way through the fjord systems, leaving from the small town of Tortel. And we made it out to 3 different sites. The yellow stars here are 2 base camps. They're basically cabins that are out in the middle of the fjords here that we're able to use as a home base. And then we made it to 3 different glaciers. Those are on the right here. The first is Olfidro. This glacier terminates into a proglacial lake. That's the dark blue color that drains into the fjords. And then Bernardo and Tepanos are both tidewater glaciers in contact with the ocean. And each of the orange dots basically represents transects where we were able to collect data on ocean properties, and I'll get to that in a few slides. The purple triangles show places where we set up time-lapse cameras to monitor the actual terminus, the front of the glaciers, at these study sites as well. Just a few photos from the field and going into what we did to address our hypothesis. So we collected water measurements and installed 2 time-lapse cameras. Unfortunately, we weren't able to leave the time-lapse cameras up because we had no guarantee that we'd be going back without funding secured for the next year. But the idea is to keep those up for long-term in the near future. So here's Kristen Schild here setting one up at the terminus of Tempanos. We also took measurements of water temperature, salinity, and velocity that we collected with a CTD, which is conductivity, temperature, and depth profiler. And this provided information on the amount of water discharging from the glacier, the warm ocean water in contact with the glacier itself, and then the strength of the circulation and its ability to erode the glacier terminus. So that's what we can try to get at those questions using these 2 methods. And so we collected these measurements at depths up to 10 meters on different profiles, transects in front of these 2 tidewater glaciers. On the right here is one of our collaborators. This is Raul. He works with CONAF as a marine biologist. He was one of our biggest proponents of getting us down there to do this work in a national park. You can imagine it's pretty difficult to get the permits in a different country, but he's really excited because he's interested in the marine plankton and the marine organisms in these fjord systems and how those might be changing over time as the glaciers change. So he's actually collecting plankton here at the same sites where we're taking our CTD measurements. So here's a first look at some of the sample data that we collected. Since this was the first season we got out there, it was mostly to see what's possible, what sites we can access, and create this partnership. But we were very fortunate to make it to the front of Tempanos Glacier. All these orange dots again are transects where we collected CTD data. Again, the purple was where we set up a time-lapse camera. And showing on the bottom here are 2 different profiles of depth in meters plotted against distance across the fjord. So these 2 profiles are taken from this, again, red box here, about as close as the glacier terminus as we could get with the boat. And what they show is a clear boundary of fresh glacial runoff and warm ocean water around 6 meters depth. So in both the salinity and temperature, you see that change that's pretty distinct. So this is an example of the data that we were able to collect. And the idea going forward in the next few years is that we'll continue to collect these, ideally on a bi-monthly basis, because our collaborators are out in the field year round, basically at these sites. So if we can leave them with equipment and training how to use it, we can actually get a much better temporal and spatial resolution of this data and how it's changing over time, which is going to be really critical to answering these questions. Another really exciting finding that we have that we weren't expecting is when we actually drove into the fjord system up here in the upper left by boat to get to our base camp at the yellow star here, the boat captain noticed a bunch of large icebergs being discharged, more than normal, out into the fjord. And he instantly knew that most likely this lake was draining And that's exactly what was going on. So this lake usually drains about once a year, according to the park rangers out there. It hasn't really been studied or quantified, but what happens is after it reaches a certain pressure from the water building up, it drains out beneath the flank of Bernardo Glacier here. It goes around the corner and out into the actual ocean fjord system. So here we witnessed the earliest known glacial outburst flood in this region. And again, that was as a result of the lake breaking and flooding under the ice environment. So these flood events have a massive impact on glacier behavior, so speed, crevassing, stability. You can imagine when this water is draining, there's a lot going on at the terminus of the glacier. So that's something that we want to understand and study. And witnessing this event, we had to update our hypothesis, at least for glaciers impacted by these events, that it's clear that to fully understand this ice-ocean dynamic system, we need longer term measurements to capture both the episodic events, which are the Gloff events, as well as persistent forcing as ocean warming. This is just further evidence that that Gloff event was going on. Large icebergs stranded well above this high tide line. After several days when the water kind of went back down, we were able to drive the boat in here and take these pictures and walk around. And down the bottom here, this is the actual lake. It's located where this little camera's taken. And again, this fills up and drains beneath the flank of the glacier and goes around the corner when it drains out into the ocean. So a really big event. It's about 10 kilometers in scale, that lake. Yeah, so I'll just move on to what's next. That was most of the data we collected on this first field season. So we want to capture the timing of those Gloff events to kind of differentiate between local and global responses to climate change and see how they impact glaciers on the individual level. We want to continue these long-term bi-monthly measurements. This is going to allow us to quantify the relationship between these glaciers and their environment. And we can do this with the help of our partners who are out there on a monthly basis. So that's really amazing that they can go out to the site once a month and collect all these CTD measurements and check on our time-lapse cameras and download the photos to make sure everything's working. And then we know we can't yet answer some of those really big questions. So the idea here again is to use this data to show, yes, we can get to these sites and collect data and use that to apply for a larger external proposal. And I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the outreach work that we're doing here. So as I mentioned, I worked down here about 3 years before we started this project. And a lot of that work was working with the local communities and getting them involved in our science. So one piece of feedback that we kept hearing working here was that the scientists come in, they do their field work, they hop on a boat or a plane and head out, and they don't actually tell the people in the town what they're doing. And I understand that in some way because we're on tight budgets and tight schedules, and we just usually get in and do our work and leave. But we wanted to try to add a few extra days onto our trips and work with the town. So we were able to access some of these places with them because that's the biggest problem for these communities, that they don't have access to these areas, even though they live right here. And what we did was we worked with kids from 3 communities in this region. So here's that Southern Patagonia ice field. Each star is one of these little towns. There's a few hundred people in each one, maybe. This is Puerto Den. You can only access it by boat, and it takes several days to get to it. It's located out in the middle of the fjord system here. Here's Tortel, where we left from. Again, it's all boardwalks, no roads. It takes several days to reach this. There is one road into the town. And then V.O. Higgins is the same. You could fly in or take several days to drive there. So really remote. In our years working in these places, we found that many of the people, especially children in these towns, have never seen an ice field or any large glaciers, even though they're right in their backyard. So even in this photo, you can see a glacier up on this mountain, but they don't really understand or know what that glacier is because it's just access and one teacher that teaches this whole town. So it's really hard for them to get the science foundations at a young age. So our goal was to work with CONAF, Round River, as well as the Chilean Navy to bring kids from each of these communities out to the ice field by boat. And we really wanted to spark their interest in this work in the hopes that they come back to these communities down the road and can continue to answer some of these questions. So I'm going to show this quick little 2-minute video. This was taken by my coworker. So these were some of the trips that we went on with the students, and hopefully you'll get the sound that comes through with it.
Muy lindo Portugal. Encantado de ser acá. Salir en el glaciar no lo he hecho nunca. Va a ser primera vez.
Y eso me gusta Tortel. me siento más libre y quiero aprovechar todo lo que tengo alrededor para conocerlo.
Que intentemos de conocer todo lo que nos rodea, porque así uno se conecta más con la naturaleza.
Sí, estoy acá del lago Higgins. No, tal vez hemos vivido toda la vida acá y no alcanzamos a ver los glaciares cuando estábamos más grandes.
El objetivo de este viaje es sacar a las jóvenes al Parque Nacional Bernardo Higgins, enseñarles un poco y sobre la glaciología del campo de hielo sur.
Ella nunca ha ido. Sí, bonito que igual conozca.
Yo creo que la mayoría de los chicos no conocen un glaciar. El conocimiento está ahí mismo, está en la naturaleza.
Mira, el glaciar ya está. Sí, por allá. Allá vamos.
Yo quería conocer los glaciares para conocer lo que yo tengo en la Patagonia, lo lindo que es Tortel. A pesar que sea un pueblo chico, tiene maravillas grandes.
Bueno, yo nunca he visto el glaciar. Entonces esta es mi primera vez que... Al glaciar Higgins. Ahí esa fue la parte que más me gustó porque era muy bonito.
De los glaciares. Pucha, no.
Significa todo lo que he vivido, esto ha sido lo mejor de mi vida.
So I wanted to share that with you, some of the exciting stuff outside of the science that we're doing down there. And I'll leave it at that just for time's sake and take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Any questions for Scott?
Scott, I have a question about your outreach work. Are you also doing anything like leaving lesson plans or kits for the local teachers so they can continue your work when you're all not down there?
Yeah, so oftentimes we had the Park Service with us, CONAF there, and we'd let them teach the lessons. We'd say, here's stuff we have, materials we have, and then they would do the teaching. And the idea is that since they're down there all the time, that they would then continue this on a more yearly basis. We gave them little kits like you can do glacial flow in a PVC pipe. We left all that with them. So yeah, that's the idea, is that we don't want to really be in the foreground. We want to be in the background and just leave people, the teachers there, the material to do this.
Super.
Yeah, I have a question, Scott. So in terms of, you said you're measuring the water temperature, salinity, and velocity. In terms of the salinity, what are you getting at with that? I mean, I'm imagining that higher salinity is going to have faster melting, but aren't the oceans also getting fresher?
We're trying to, yeah, so Kristen's driving the science questions behind this, so I'll try to speak to it. But we're trying to find where that boundary is and where it's in contact with the glacial terminus on these glaciers that end in the ocean. And so where that warmer temperature is where it's going to drive the melting. So it's kind of that simple from beneath. And we want to monitor how maybe this changes over time. Does that depth deepen or get smaller? And then how does the ocean water getting up to it, how is that temperature changing? So that's the big driver here with collecting those measurements and trying to get a nice record over a few years.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Well, if there aren't further questions, let me end up as I usually do, and then we'll all see each other next week. So I started with Heather. Heather's study is for the birds, particularly archaeological bird remains that can help recognize the presence of El Niño Modoki. Now, Modoki may seem like a really dry topic, but any success in this study would be a real feather in Heather's cap. We know that Modoki must have affected the irrigation-based societies of the Peruvian coast by cutting water flow, but we don't have a deep time record of these. If Heather's work can provide even a taste of this El Nino flavor in the pre-European past, that will really stir the pot in terms of how we understand past human ecodynamics in the region. Moving on to Ian Nesbitt. Ian gave a damned interesting talk on a core issue, where to drill in lakes. He clearly feels intensely about this point. One might say he has strong feelings or deep sentiments about it. Ian wants to be sure that the variability of deposits across any lake bed is on everyone's radar, particularly georadar, when picking a site. It would be rotten to core in the wrong place for the record that you want. And finally, Scott Braddock. Scott gave a cool talk about Chile glaciers that are on the fast track to oblivion. One glacier is named Tempanos, so one might say it's a case of Tempanos Fugit. Scott is trying to determine what is driving glacial retreat, but his project is in early stages, so he's getting warmer, but doesn't have a clear answer yet. That's it for today. See you all in a week.